Bongani, Dumelang, Sambonani, and welcome to the AVRIC podcast, a podcast that aims to bring clarity to the concept of violence and its consequences in the lives of victims and survivor groups, as well as the perpetrators and their descendants.
In this episode, we uncover the profound insights shared by Professor Mays Imad in her lecture, Addressing Continuities of Trauma in Higher Education. Join us as we examine the lasting impact of trauma on students and institutions. Prof Imad weaves personal stories, neuroscience, and student perspectives to advocate for a compassionate, trauma-informed approach to education that challenges us to reimagine learning spaces as sites of healing and transformation.
What I want to talk about today, I am a neuroscientist, so I look at the world through the lens of the nervous system. How does the nervous system experiences and responds to the world? I'm also, in my country, I am an immigrant, and I study the kind of the interactions of trauma, racism, what possibilities for healing are. So what I want to talk about trauma, not just in the broad sense, but in the context of higher education. And I want to take us back to 2020. What happened in 2020? We all know that there was a pandemic, and I began to explore why is it that students, and I would say people worldwide, are so overwhelmed, and mental health was really at a crisis level. When you look at the literature from 2020, what are the factors that are causing the people everywhere to feel the mental distress? There are four themes that emerge. There was pre-existing loneliness. The younger generation, typically the older generation, after they retire, they experience loneliness. And about 5 years ago, there was a change in the data where now it is the younger generation, the youth and young people are the population that is experiencing the most loneliness. So pre-existing loneliness, and then all of a sudden there was no peer support because of all of the isolation. So there was a theme of isolation. And I often tell my students that the brain is very much a social organ. We are wired, created to connect. And that connection help us make meaning of the world and help us, kind of anchor and ground our sense of self. The second theme is that all of a sudden we had suspensions of plans, and there was loss of purpose and the why. And so the theme here is the loss of meaning. The third one is there was loss of routine, loss of reduced movement or no exercise, that there was a physiological theme that emerged. And then importantly, and this was an overwhelming theme, the unpredictability, loss of autonomy. This was a theme of uncertainty. And I tell my students that the brain is very much a social organ that likes to connect, to make meaning, and so to predict. So there was loss of that uncertainty. Now, what also happened in 2020, so we began to talk about trauma. There's trauma everywhere. People are talking about trauma. So I argue that there was trauma before 2020. What happened in 2020, in a way, it helps democratize trauma and make it, in a sense, it's okay to talk about the trauma because prior to 2020, what was happening is, and this is in the sense of globally, but also I'm looking at it in the sense of the United States. We have a supremacy, say, problem. We have a racism. We're not post-racial. There is, in the U.S., we have, this is not just in the U.S. and globally, poverty and erasure of knowledge, In the US, there's the mass incarceration and also the mass shooting. We have a colonialism is still very much impacting people and communities, and imperialism. So I'm sharing all of this to say that, it wasn't just COVID, right? We have wars, there's a climate crisis, loss of agency. So when you speak with young people, they talk about loss of their voices don't matter. And that can really trigger this sense of loss of apathy. So what I say is that we have trauma, and it's not just individual trauma, and it's not just pandemic trauma, it's a collective trauma. And we could look at trauma from many different perspectives. We could look at it anthropologically, linguistically, sociologically. I happen to look at it also physiologically. When I look at it physiologically, there's been, I said that 2020 democratized trauma. We can talk about it, right? And at the same time, there's been a lot of attacks on trauma. If everything is trauma, is anything trauma? And, can we go back to normal? And so I say that, well, let's look at the physiology. And the physiology tells us that trauma is very much, it's not just in my head, so in my body, and my body impacts where I go and how I interact. So it's a physiological problem. And I'm going to share with you one element of that physiological problem. We know that when we experience traumatic events, it could be one event, it could be a series of events, it impacts the regions in the brain that deal with the sense of self. So in this article, Ruth Lanius and her colleagues, and Ruth Lanius is a trauma specialist. She's an MD, PhD, and studies the sense of self. What happens when we experience these traumatic events? We start questioning who we are, who we think we are, who we thought we are. We start questioning just our place in the world and our place in the future. So the sense of self is very much impacted. And what I want to share with you, I'm going to share throughout the presentation, are quotes from students with whom I've done research, right, related to their experiences in higher education. And I want you to reflect on what are your experiences? What's been for example, your colleagues' experiences, or your children, or your peers? So here's an example this is from 2020, where the students, and we've published about this, the students we interviewed says, prior to the pandemic, I was a good student in the sense that I got all my work done on time and was super passionate about learning. Then I went home and tried to continue my work. It was horrible, like all the missing assignments and lack of motivation and staring blankly at my work. Now, this student continues and says, what happened to me? Or who was I? Or who? So continues and says, I was trying to figure out what's wrong with me. Right? Did I lose my cognitive function? Was I like, maybe this is the real me? Maybe I'm actually really unmotivated and lazy, and maybe I was never a good student. I felt lonely and embarrassed and scared. So it takes us back to the sense of loneliness. And in fact, the research from the World Health Organization, from the Surgeon General of the United States, talking about this existential sense of loneliness that young people are experiencing. And again, going back to who am I, the sense of self. There's another quote that I'll share, part of this from. This is in 2024 now at a different institution, where the student says, we navigate college life while dealing with trauma can feel incredibly isolating. Many of us are silently struggling with emotional pain and a sense of loneliness that others can't see. It can be very invisible. Our struggle deeply affects our ability to concentrate and do well on exams. And the students is actually going to offer, where do we go from here? So what scholars talk about, they talk about how, again, it is physiological, but also psychological, that at the physiological level, our sense of who we are, who I am as a person, as a human being, as a sister and a daughter, and right, is impacted when we experience trauma. Anthropologist Rebecca Lester uses the word pushes us to the edge of existence. A lot of the students that come to our institutions are experiencing that, and sometimes they don't have the language to and I talk about how learning is very physiological. Learning is social, is emotional, is also neurobiological. So we're expecting our students to come, to learn, to grow, to thrive, and they're experiencing all of that at the same time. Now, in the word of our colleague and Professor Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, she asked this really pivotal question: what does it mean to be human in the aftermath of trauma and violence? And I understand that this is asked in the context of South Africa and apartheid and post-apartheid, but it's very applicable. I've brought this question, and for years now I've been asking this question: what does it mean to be human in higher education? I would argue in the midst of ongoing exclusion, racism, the trauma of all of that, and I would also argue that violence. So what does that mean? Now, to turn to the word of Jamaican American philosopher and cultural critic and Professor Sylvia Wynter, whose work has really it's been I've been trying to bring her work to my neurobiological classes. And what Sylvia Wynter is trying to get us to beckon us to think about the role of education when it comes to answering these questions. What does it mean to be human? So here Sylvia Wynter says empire's most powerful apparatus is the education system, and uses the word initiate us. It's a very deliberate, laborious process, intentional, right? It initiates us and goes on and talks about the ethno-class of humanity, right? Human and who is not. And, in the context of Americans, it can only do so in terms of us and the non-us. Where Sylvia Wynter is taking us, and you'll see in the next slide, is that it is those systems, higher education, that kind of initiates people in society, members in our society, to think at a cellular, implicit level, the fully human and the non. So after the Rodney King trial in the US, the early 90s, we learned that the Los Angeles Police Department and other police departments, they were using the designation NHI. And NHI stands for No Humans Involved. And what these designations mean is they get cases. The police department, they would get cases of Black and brown individuals, queer individuals, trans individuals, but they give them the designation, homeless individuals, they give them the designation of NHI. They don't investigate them, they don't. So this became who is human and who is not. And Sylvia Wynter writes a letter to her colleagues at Stanford, and she really challenges them and says, these police officers and detectives and law enforcement, they went through our school, our curriculum. How did they walk out with this understanding human and non, full human and non? She says, where did the system of classification come from? She calls this cognitive distortions. And further, how did they come to conceive what it means to be human? So what I want to argue now, I want to argue that perhaps one of the most critical questions we ought to be asking within higher education is this question of what does it mean to be fully human? when there is ongoing trauma, when there is ongoing violence, right? And what does it mean to uplift human dignity and really like wrestle with this question that Pumla has written extensively about. I've written about the how these things. This is in an article that was recently published, and it was in Change magazine. They dedicated an entire edition to affirmative action. And in the article, I talk about trauma, whether it's a trauma of war or systemic racism. They show up within higher education. And I talk about, again, how these things for our students impact and rupture and continue to really wound that sense of self. This is echoed, for example, in the words of a University of California and San Diego students we interviewed for research on exclusion in the STEM, where the student says, I'd be sitting in lecture and the professor would tell a story about something, and all of a sudden I'm thinking about my father and how he was denied access to this type of institution. I feel rage inside, and before you know it, the class is over. I realize that I'm not listening anymore. But when I'm, so yeah, being here sometimes it doesn't take much to be triggered, because the institutions oftentimes, some of my students say the wall remind us, or the pictures remind us of history of how our ancestors were treated and excluded, and so on. And in a more recent, this is from the Connecticut College, the Muslim Student Association. We didn't have encampment, but the students put together a statement to support encampments. And this is by the Muslim Student Association and was endorsed by 11 or 12 other student organizations. And here, the students are talking about, we're constantly being told that education is life. It's going to help you build a better world, human dignity, a world where human rights and equality apply to all people, not just a selected few. And then in the next paragraph, they use the word heartbreak. They say how we are heartbroken to realize that actually this doesn't apply to everyone. Some are seen as the human and dignity, and others are not. They use the word heartbreak and how disenchanted they feel. What I say is that when the students repeatedly experience this misalignment between what the ideal, what they think the education can do, and the societal practices or the educational practices, a rupture happens. So, and this rupture perpetuates the trauma, perpetuates that exclusion. And so what I want to pivot right now and argue, I want to argue that, much like Sylvia Winter argued, that the ethos of higher education is one, like it is right now, is one that perpetuates that rupture. It's very much, and I'm going to bring in another scholar, a Mexican-American Chicana scholar, Laura Rendon, who's really written phenomenal, remarkable work in higher education about validation theory, about students from marginalized community. And in 2005, she wrote this really remarkable article about, she says, recasting agreements that govern teaching and learning, an intellectual and spiritual framework for transformation. It's a mouthful. So what she argues in this article, she says higher education has certain practices, and those practices, agreements, assumptions, those practices are meant to have this ethnoclass. It works for some, it doesn't work for others. And it really impacts our sense of humanity. And she says, in order for us to really move forward in a way that elevates and really is rooted in humanistic principle, we need to recast agreements. So here, and we can use a QR code to get the article, the dominant belief system is powerful, is entrenched, validated, and constantly rewarded by the social structure that created it. So much so that even when we begin to see that some of the agreements in the belief system are flawed and in need of change, we find it very difficult to challenge them. These are the agreements, and I'll share with you some of those agreements. And again, in the article, she goes through each of those agreements and how they are meant to separate. They are meant to separate us. There's an us, there's a them, at the curriculum level, at the leadership level, and the problem is it not just erodes our well-being. She talks about how it impacts our well-being. Why? We're not supposed to be disintegrated and separated. Again, at a neurobiological level, we were created to. The brain is very much social organ. So. Excuse me, I want to share with you a little bit about those agreements. So I said I am in the STEM, and recently we published an article looking at, she published it in 2005. In 2023, what are the agreements that still show up in STEM? And here we say that we can't talk about humanity and inclusion and DEI unless we look at the foundation. So if we look at it, we argue, and this is very much aligned with Laura Rendon, that the higher education is very much grounded in, it privileges Eurocentric ways of knowing. It privileges the agreement of scarcity. It privileges the agreement of objectivity. What does that mean? And the result of this is, and I won't go through this, but for example, I'll just go through right here, the agreement of scarcity. What the agreement of scarcity is that we have the culture of higher education is what? It's a zero-sum mentality. I'm going to compete with you for that one grant, and then we're going to compete for who's going to be, right? And so there is the competition, is a perfectionism according to some ideal. In fact, one of our reviewers for the article said that, all of the agreements could be traced back to that Eurocentric of knowing, and then the workaholicism. And this one here on this, I don't know if you could see that the agreement of compartmentalization is very much this grounded in the Anthropocene, the man, the ideal, the right, and then it's more separation. And so the compartmentalization is about, it doesn't matter what's happening outside, in society, across the world, the expectation is you come, show up, full self, you learn, you retain, right? And the truth is, even neurobiologically, that's just not possible. Learning is very much social and emotional. In the words of one of the students, higher education expects students and professors to drop everything they are in the classroom, even though that they have emotional events that represent them. So here the student is echoing, is saying very much, this is not realistic. And in the article, us and Dr. Rendon say that it really impacts our humanity. We can't even talk about healing because the practices perpetuate that rupture. So, but back to the article. So she critiques the system, she critiques the agreements, and for example, Another agreement that is not mentioned is the agreement of ableism, the agreement of neurotypicality. And then she says, we have an opportunity to reimagine other agreements, to come up with a new dream field, is what she calls it. And she proposes the following steps for transformation. And she argues that it's not going to be easy because we have to go to the foundation and dig deep and really start examining, for example, the agreements being privileged, how the agreement impact the whole, impact and causes more exclusion, causes more separation, and interrogate why is it being privileged, who is it serving. Then explore what are the available options that you have. What might it look like to have a different agreement, to, for example, run the department by department, not grounded in competition, but in collaboration. And then recast these agreements. So even though she starts by talking about theory, she pivots and say, okay, practically speaking, what do we do? How do we move forward? And what we do in this article, we give examples of what do we do here? And instead of privileging the Eurocentric ways of knowing, how important it is to understand and work with and center pluralistic ways of knowing. What does it mean to look at indigenous ways of, indigenous epistemology and Afrocentric epistemology? This is in the case of STEM. It's applicable to other disciplines. The agreement of scarcity, what would our curriculum, departments, and institution look like, and how might that translate if we were to multiplicity and sustainability and abundance? And then finally, what does it mean to move from the Anthropocene to the Symbiocene, interconnection, our interrelatedness, our so on. So some of the work that I have done, I've done work with in trying to immerse myself in pluralistic ways of knowing. I've gone to West Africa and East Africa, and I've worked with educators there and practitioner indigenous healers. And this is my mentor, Eric Bedosso, in Senegal. And Eric Bedosso, and this is one of my former students, Dr. Amavi Bailey. When we have these conversations, he reminds me about the human. Because in Africa, traditionally, we're interested not just in some economical climbing the ladder. Because in the global South, and he speaks particularly about Africa, we educate to produce humans to help humanity. It's very much different than that Eurocentric, Cartesian, I am, think, therefore I am. This is very much about the Ubuntu ways of us, the interconnection. So we wrote an article with actually a colleague from Uganda and a student from the US arguing the following. We argue that if higher education institutions don't pay attention to the trauma that the students are coming with, intergenerational trauma that they walk into our institutions with, and the trauma that they experience within the institutions, that we are engaging in institutional betrayal. Term is coined by Freud and Smith, psychologists in the US, in 2014. Came up with it. They wrote an article called Institutional Betrayal. And institutional betrayal is when an institution, higher education, doesn't pay attention to the things that are impacting the well-being of the students. So here we argue that there was trauma before 2020 within higher education, and that we need to, if we really want to think about not just the students we are graduating, but the future of our humanity, we need to pay attention to that trauma that the school causes, and also that coming to the school. What does it mean to engage in trauma-informed education for intergenerational well-being? And we argue, and I won't go through all of this, the article is open source, so you could do it. We argue that we need to move from the betrayal to institutional courage. And institutional courage is one that really examines agreements, recast agreements, think about trauma, think about, so we say that we have a duty of care. We have that duty of care implores us to look at a really deep level about equity. What does equity access mean? That we have social responsibility. This is not just about checking boxes that says we graduated this many students. What is, again, educating humans to help humanity. And ultimately that this is about uplifting and upholding human dignity. And like I said, this is available. So coming to an end of my talk, I want to circle back to the student from 2024 who says that we're coming with a lot of trauma and it impacts us. And the student continues, acknowledge our trauma. They're asking, offer compassionate, understanding environment. All of that can make a difference in helping us feel seen, supported, capable of healing. Recognizing that. So I say, as educators right now, in this moment, in this critical moment, we bear a really profound responsibility, and we also have a very unique opportunity. What does it mean to cultivate environment that supports meaningful and sustainable learning, the type of learning that elevates, that repairs, heals, and transforms? This is a process that, again, I argue that it has to be at the root level. I'm going to go back to Sylvia Wynter, like 2 more slides. And Sylvia Wynter, remember, asked, who decides those cognitive distortions? And she beckons us. We cannot give up writing stories about what it means to be human that displace those at the foundation. There's no order in the world that can exist or hold together, including an empire, without a founding story. She's asking us, can we come up with another founding story? Right? Will it make space within it to be able to write a new foundation? So again, being human. I want to end with a story. I teach, one of the classes I teach is neurophysiology. Another one is human physiology. And a few years ago, a student who had graduated my classes, came and said to me, to visit me, and she's doing graduate school, and said, isn't it interesting that we went through an entire class on human physiology and not once did we talk about what it means to be human? I thought you had sent her. I was like, what? She's very right? We go into the class, immediately start talking about physiology and all the, and so on, and we didn't. So this is when I began to really bring the work of Sylvia Wynter to my classes. And I want to share with you a quote from a student I got her permission to share her name, where she says, I feel that humanity tends to be lost most often in sciences, specifically biological, whereby a student may be asked to focus on a cell or a brain, thus losing sight of the person behind it. A well-adjusted physician or researcher understands the nature of humanity and understands that they are treating a person, not a cell or a brain, even if that is where their focus lies. And the student ends with, understanding what it means to be human is the only way that we can appropriately treat other humans. Because our experience is so much more than just cells, it's feeling and emotion and love. And on that note of love, I want to thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Mays, for this really incredible sharing with us in so many. I mean, you've just touched on so many issues around the human, around trauma, and within the institutional space. I sort of feel that we should all be assigned her readings. Don't you think we should just, make your readings available? They're so rich. And I like the way you end. And we don't often talk about love, do we? And yet I think actually love encompasses these notions of humanity, of being human, that if we foreground love, there is a sense of once love goes before, then the rest follows. Right? Being human and treating one another in that way follows. So so these are just comments really before I open to the floor. I'm very interested in your bringing Sylvia Wynter. I mean, she's now actually, so many scholars are turning to her. And what I want you to elaborate for us, I mean, there's so many things that I took a note of. Your notion of institutional courage. And the notion of courage and understanding Sylvia Wynter's own courage in the way that she speaks about what it means to be human. How might we, if you could map out for us, what would that look like? There's themes that you brought to bear in your discussion as the Global South orientation to relationships, right? From which Sylvia Wynter herself draws from in defining what it means to be human. And then there is the institutional courage that you call. What does that look like? How might you imagine the application of those notions in the way that institutions engage the communities that come to students, staff, and so on? How would you think about the application of those because at the end of the day, in the final analysis of things, we use theory to become, better in the way we create processes and procedures within our institutions, in the way we relate to one another. How might we think about ways of taking that perspective into these spaces?
Yeah. So thank you. That's really important. Courage is not easy. And courage oftentimes doesn't work in a vacuum. Grounded in love and in relational. So I think, what does it look like? It has to be context dependent. So it has to be, what is the community? I think having communities where you meet and you talk about these issues and you imagine together, kind of having like the grassroots movement that what does it look like? Starting with the micro, what does it look like at the meso? What does it look like at the macro? I think that there is a tendency to want to immediately scale up, scalability and so on, which is a very Eurocentric model. And healing doesn't happen that way. When we talk about, for example, my students, if there is an injury, if there is a wound, it starts very local. very local. All the white blood cells migrate there, and the other systems are trying to support and so on. And in the words of another wonderful scholar, Adrienne Marie Brown, she says, "Small is big." Right? So what that means is in a way we need to have these communities of beloved who gather around this notion of courage and love, and imagine the radical imagination of what does it look like, and I think do it very much. Before I started taking this work out, I started having conversation with just one-on-one. And so, and again, in a context dependent, and then have, like, what does it look like to then break silos and go to this discipline or this community. I think it's also very important when we do this work in academia, we often stay within academia, right? I think it's really important to draw the wisdom from the community, elders, community members come and work with us on this small is big.
Thank you. There's always this problem of scaling up. Everyone wants big numbers, must show the impact, in terms of big numbers. And yet, actually, you're right, the impact begins with small. And then, you can grow from that. Because often the problems are so big that you can't just suddenly say, okay, this is going to affect 1,000 people. Often funders problem, as you say, it goes right up to the foundations that fund these projects. So this is a great opportunity for us to be in conversation with Prof Mays. We have a bit of time, actually, we have more than enough time. So there is a hand that's coming up.
Hi, I'm Olivia. I'm from the Department of Economics, and one of my research interests is in mental health economics. You mentioned something that caught my attention was a student saying, struggling to focus. And I'm very interested in hearing you as a neuroscientist. More and more people are being diagnosed or self-identifying as having ADD, attention deficit disorder. And I'm just wondering, like, I'm a PhD candidate, but I'm also an instructor. I teach. When you're dealing with students, like if a student says they're struggling to focus, I mean, what do we do? And just from a physiological point of view, how do we even know, is the student really struggling with focus? Are they taking a chance? Because there's always students who try to game the system. So, people do that. So, and just from what your research and your studies of neuroscience, has there been an increase in more people having this problem of focusing? And is it like something you're born with and that gets triggered? I don't know if you know where I'm going. I basically want to know, it just seems like more and more people are struggling to focus. And is it partly environmental because of information overload? Or is there something physiological that's also happening that is coming from trauma?
So important, such an important question. So there is concrete data that there has been more diagnosis of ADD and ADHD since 2020.
Specifically 2020, okay.
I haven't looked if, it's been on the rise. Now, why is that? Is there a causal relationship? We're not sure, but there is data, there's research that substantiate a very direct interaction or correlation, strong correlation between trauma and ADHD. There's something, so the nervous system, you could think of it as the nervous system is so overwhelmed, it can't process sensory information the way it normally does, right? So some practitioners will argue that if you want to treat ADHD, it's not just take a pill and that's it. You also got to get to the root of what's happening. So trauma is I think when students say they can't focus, there has also been many reports substantiating that actually they are having a very hard time focusing. This is more than they are trying to game the system. You talked about the sensory overload. So think about what happened. If we just focus 2020 onward, we sat in our homes, we had the screens, sitting on the screens, and we didn't like step out and interact and so on. So there was massive sensory overload. The information that was coming to the nervous system is much faster and much more than the nervous system, the speed at which it processes and filters. And so that sensory overload, you talk to people now and they say, I'm exhausted, right? I'm not fully recovered from the pandemic. And part of it is then the pandemic was over. Then we went back and business as usual, but we haven't paused to decompress, right? So I think it's very complicated. I think, for example, just as a practical example, I had, let's say, this much material I needed to cover in my physiology class. And then I started seeing that since the pandemic, this is not practical. I lose students, even the student who is the most, when I get to like a third of it, right? So I began to think about how do I need to re-examine agreements that I have about. So I think it's a really important question that is, it's environmental, it's physiological, it's.
Thank you.
Yes, we'll take two questions. So there's Viran, and was you or you? Person with headphones. Yes, you say your name.
Okay.
I also aware. How do we deal with the online? Sorry that I forget.
If there are any.
If they are okay. Yes, please. Can start with Viran and then it's you.
My mind is caught between I want to say 2 points of like the world of work and where there's competition, the show must go on. And there's also another part of being human where you need to take in what you're feeling and everything, right? But in this instance of like the institutions that we're in, I think it came to mind the history of the institutions themselves and how they also impact on trauma and how you have to be strong because there's this point of you need to preserve what like your ancestors, like you're here because your ancestors fought for you or whatever kind of emotional trauma that you're going through, right? So I think my question is more based on how do we then change the narrative of you have to persevere and get through this and do that and do that. Also just taking in that the show must also go on. Like me sitting down and taking in my trauma and missing class also means me failing my modules. And I cannot afford to do that. So how do you like find or crack that balance between the history of institutions and where they lead you to, which is the world of work, where you don't have time to take in your emotions. You can only take enough sick leaves or, that kind of conversations, I think.
Yeah. Yes. Can you take Viran's question? Yeah.
So it's very much just like an add-on to that, and it's something I've been quite fascinated in quite a while because you mentioned that a lot of what we're doing, so our 3 agreements, basically in some way don't correspond to what our brains have evolved or meant to do. So, I mean, I'm sorry if I'm asking this in the wrong way, but can you explain what that split is doing to us in a particular way? I mean, that's what I'm quite interested in. Because, I mean, one of the things I've noticed just amongst my own generation is an extreme level of anxiety, and that may have to do with career prospects, but I actually don't think it does, because I actually think most people are feeling this at a very young age, and not actually having the language to explain why am I so anxious all the time.
Yeah, really important. So, there is a physician in Flint, Michigan. Flint, Michigan is the area where they had the water crisis. It was led in mostly African American communities that were affected. And the physician that broke the story is an Iraqi American physician. She's an immigrant, and she wrote a book called What the Eyes Don't See. Really important book. And in 2020, she wrote an op-ed in the New York Times. And the title of the op-ed is I am sick of telling children to be resilient. And she argues there that, she interviews this one kid who, I mean, he did the insurmountable and against all odds did really well and finished school and said, you know, we celebrate as like this as a story of success, but this kid almost died trying to, right? And she said that, you know, rather than turning to like individual kids and saying, be resilient, the burden should not be on them, it should be on the system. How can we create resilient spaces that hold the space for when I'm about to fall apart because there's trauma, or there is a structure that holds me? This is an agreement that she's arguing for. So I think, you know, I've had students who go through my classes and my curriculum and everything, and they come back and they say, you know, it's tough in the real world. Like, there is competition. And so I think it's very important to, what does it mean to kind of try to engender new agreements and help also the students navigate the reality that it's different outside, but also take that culture with them to the outside. You know, I think small wins is what I try to focus on. There's that, yeah. To your question, you know, I think what we go through it in the article, and we talk about how each of those agreements impact our humanity. They are literally making us sick. At the neurobiological level, what I will say is that they are causing more fragmentation. The brain thrives when it can make connections and meaning making and storytelling and pausing to the brain is, and a lot of these, you know, agreements and these practices, it's very much fragmented. So it's causing the brain to feel less whole, I would say. I mean, the brain is very embodied. It's causing the body to feel less whole. So, for example, I don't need to turn on the news to know that there is like war and genocide and poverty, and it impacts very much and we're expected to show up and be like everything is okay. So what I say, you know, I say in the context of the U.S., you know, I say it's a dissociated society. You know, people are walking around in a state of dissociation, no connection, and in a like snap, and people like just lose it, and so it's really making us sick. It's not in your head. It's.
Okay, so there is you, and then it's Philemon. Thanks, please.
Yes. My question is, what can people do to foster their own ability to imagine again? I say again because as children they have huge imaginations. I can think of myself as a child and remember playing these imagination games.
Yeah.
And it's so important to think about, you know, new possibilities in the world for world making, changing agreements and everything. And it's a word you used a few times, imagine.
Yeah.
But I feel as if it's something that's lost.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's so much research on how education system and higher education, you know, like these like sucks creativity from especially children. And this is very personal for me. I was talking with my therapist not too long ago, and I said, I can't imagine. It's very interesting. I said, I grew up in a culture that is all about the symbiocene. We learned from the ants, and we learned from the elephants, and we learned from the mountains, and it's all imagination. It's kind of like this fairy tale. And I go through the system, the education system, and it's like linear, rigid structure. And you know, it's not an either or. So I think there's a lot of unlearning There's a lot of kind of the courage to go to places that we were told this is not real knowledge, right? This is the, I think we need to, as a scientist, turn to the arts. I have been like bringing in, and I'll tell you a story. Andrea Kopp, who is a cellular biologist and has done really remarkable work on cell division, how cells divide and so on. And she really believes in bringing in the arts. And she said, we were doing this one experiment and we were getting stuck. And one of her team member is an artist. And what the artist does is they do illustration of their finding. And she said to the artist, why did you, she's drawing the cells. And she said, what is that over there? And she said, oh, it's just my artistic rendition of the, and she said, I just kept thinking about it. And that thing, which it was like an artistic artifact, turned out it gave her the instinct to imagine what could be happening at the cell. And she said, everybody in my field said to me, you're crazy. This cannot happen at the level of the cell division. And she's probably going to win the Nobel Prize for her discovery because she kept going deeper and radically imagining. I would highly recommend the work of Ruha Benjamin, who wrote a recent beautiful book called Radical Imagination.
Well, Sophia, there you are. You're going to have a role to imagine all the work of the scholars here in the center as the artist in residence at AVREC.
Yes, thank you. It's interesting your turn to the arts because I've just had a meeting with one of my PhD students who's also employed in an arts department. And she was crying because of a staffing crisis in her department where ad hoc personnel is used instead of the post being advertised, and the language she used, which is also used in the department, was one of, because if they advertise the post, they will actually lose 3 bodies. And I'm like, perhaps if you guys started thinking about people teaching as actual people, and not about man hours lost.
Scarcity.
Scarcity mindset. Then, so my question is in a roundabout way: if institutions treat people not like people, which institutions tend to do, how do you negotiate this as a teacher, as part of faculty within a system not geared towards humanity at all? So it's kind of a lot to expect of people not being treated in a humane way, to treat others in a humane way in a system where no one treats each other in a humane way. So where does one start doing that institutionally?
So I think this is the courage. This is the, it's very tempting. I mean, it's a defense mechanism to say, well, I'm not being treated this way. I'm not going to treat others this way. It's a wound. We carry that wound with us. And then, but in perpetuating that wound, it's just it hurts our own humanity. So I think it's I remember talking with a group of postdocs, and they said, we all had to go through that fire, and so now we just we expect everyone to go through. And I say, but it was inhumane. Why perpetuate it, right? So I think it begins with, I think I really believe that even like the leaders, they want a different story. They want like this humanity and repair, and because in the end it will help the institution. So I think we need to with love advocate or point to how this is not being treated as human. And so, and it's going to take time. So at my previous institution, we had 1,400 faculty members, and 1,000 of them were adjunct faculty. They were part-time. These people didn't have health insurance. They didn't have, even like, I remember working in my department, I was a department chair, somebody lost their sister suddenly, you know, and if they were going to go to the funeral, they were going to get pay deducted, right? This is how, and so I, you know, initially I started like very like meeting the rigid system with my like demands. We need to do this. Nobody was listening. But I started using the language of the heart. Started saying like what you're doing, you're perpetuating these practices. And it took 3 years for somebody to listen and say, you know, let's talk about what other possibilities are there. And so I think I try to like do imagination. I try to, you know, bring other possibilities without like making it seem like it is you against us. You know, how can I meet people in the middle? And so I could like just tell them a different story. Maybe somebody is going to listen.
I'm Eldridge from the economics department at Stellenbosch University. The one thing I'm always struck by is the demographics of a room such as this. We will discuss trauma and change. And so the one question I've got is if the institution is dominated by the people who are absent, how do we get change?
Yeah, that's a really important question. You know, I think it's so when the pandemic happened, talk about the context of the US, and I think all of higher education, but in the context of the US, what was happening is a lot of the leaders, you know, had to like make what seemed like life and death decision. Do we do this or do we do that? And if I do this, you know, these many people are going to lose their job. And so there was no room. And I remember talking with a colleague of mine who's a provost. And I said, how are you doing? And she said, there is no room for me to think about the question or answer the question. She says, I'm making these decisions, you know, day to day about, do we close this program? Do we do this? Do we do that? That, you know, may cost hundreds of employees their job. So I think in the process of being so zero focused and turning off their empathy so they could make these high stake decisions, they carried their own trauma. Leaders were carrying their own trauma. So I think sometimes, we need to meet them where they are and make the case for them that they need to pay attention to why it's so important to look at their own, you know, how this work is impacting their own humanity.
I think, to be blunt, it's the absence of white males in charge, basically. And so if the institution is led by white males who are not here, we can change.
And sometimes they are part of the convocations and alumni, and so it complicates the picture even more. Continuity. So Crispin on Zoom.
You've now got an old white male to like to balance things out.
Welcome this white male to our presence.
I'm not sure what I'm in charge of at the moment, but. I'm really interested in, like, how do we think through the implications for teacher education? Because the kind of narrative on which teacher education is based is like, generally seems to be about, well, we have these people, they don't know very much about what they're teaching, what they might be teaching, and they don't know anything about how to teach. And but it's just not a good place to start. What about starting with the hurts they bring, and seeing it? We start with redress. We start with these are things which make us human, and we're here together. And until we've acknowledged that, it's how could we move onto these other things? I mean, I've just been teaching this morning a class on violence and non-violence. It's a course, and it was like really great. When I said, the question I posed to them is, why is it hard to talk in class? And what does that have to do with? What does that have then to do with violence? Actually, yeah. So that was like really nice. But enough from me. Thanks.
Thanks, Crispin. Crispin is from Durban.
Okay, thank you so much. So, I come from a tradition that teaches that we are not a drop in the ocean. We carry the entire ocean within. And in fact, when I first started teaching, I would look at my teaching evaluation, and students will say things like, "She's impossible. She tells us on the first day of class we're behind." And we're like, just so, and I was so consumed with like covering everything and, this top down. And that really helped me to pivot. So now on the first day of class, when I start, I say, look, everything I am going to teach you, you already know. It is within you. You bring in experiences and stories that they are ancestral. And immediately I see pivot in the class. Students take ownership. Students, it's a very different starting point. So I love what you said. I think the teachers, to say they don't know, we must do this, we must do that, and it's a very top-down corporate Eurocentric model like this. The knowledge, the canon is somewhere else, and I'm going to give it to you. Rather than these teachers, they come with histories and stories and wins and challenges that could actually elevate the knowledge, open up the knowledge. So I think, having these conversations, reminding them is very powerful. It changes the dynamic profoundly.
Hi, I'm Megan. I'm from a center that thinks about sustainability in quite an open way. I find that it's possible. We have quite a small postgrad cohort, and it's quite possible to think about a learning culture and a community with a smaller group of students. And even in that very small setting, often where the stuff gets really hard is around the next step around like assessment. Mm-hmm. So I'd like to. That would be an interesting conversation around how to take the trauma conversation into assessment rather than just kind of teaching and learning culture.
Beautiful. That's a really important, because assessment, there is rigidity, there is it didn't pass the assessment. It didn't. And I always say that I have the mentor who say, what if the most important things in life turned out to be the things that we can't measure? Subtlety, love, and empathy. And what would it look like to assess? So I think, going back to we need to imagine and reimagine and our approach to assessment through a lens that is not constricted, that's very much trauma informed. I love that question.
Thank you for listening to this podcast. For more, you can check out our website.